The iron shackles were still warm when Thomas Whitfield found them lying in the dirt outside the quarters on the morning of August 14th, 1853. The metal carried body heat, and the grass beneath showed where someone had knelt to unlock them in darkness. Whitfield owned 42 people on his South Carolina cotton plantation, and every one of them was accounted for at dawn muster, except the man who'd worn those chains for 3 days straight as punishment. Elijah Cross was gone. So were the keys to the tool shed, the overseer's rifle, and Thomas Whitfield himself. By noon, when the search party rode past the far cotton field, they found the master of Ashford Plantation face down between the rows, wrists and ankles shackled to iron stakes driven deep into August clay. The sun had been working on him for hours. His lips were already cracking. The chains were his own. Ashford Plantation sat on 1,100 acres of Spartanburg County bottomland, where the Pacolet River curved like a sickle blade through red clay and pine. The soil grew cotton that fetched premium prices in Charleston, and Thomas Whitfield had inherited the property from his father in 1846, along with the mechanisms required to extract profit from it. Those mechanisms included a 2-story whitewashed house with columns, a cotton gin that could process 500 pounds a day, a smokehouse, a stable, and 42 human beings whose bodies and labor he owned absolutely under South Carolina law. Whitfield was 31 years old in 1853. He had married well, to Margaret Thornton of a prominent Charleston family, and she had given him 2 sons before dying of fever in 1850. He ran Ashford with a foreman named Silas Creek, a man from Georgia who understood that profit required discipline, and discipline required fear. Creek carried a leather strap on his belt and a revolver in his coat, and he used both with the casual efficiency of someone who'd spent 20 years managing enslaved labor across 3 states. The quarters stood 200 yards from the main house, a row of 8 cabins built from rough-cut pine with dirt floors and stone chimneys that smoked in winter. 42 people lived in those cabins in family groups when Whitfield permitted it, and alone when he did not. They woke before dawn to work cotton fields that stretched from the river to the county road, and they returned after dark to cornmeal and salt pork rationed weekly by Creek, according to calculations Whitfield kept in a leather ledger. Elijah Cross had lived at Ashford for 11 years. Whitfield purchased him in 1842 from a Virginia planter liquidating assets after a bad tobacco season. The bill of sale listed him as male, age approximately 20, no scars, good teeth, literate. That last notation should have raised questions, but Whitfield had needed field hands, and the price was fair. Creek put Elijah to work in the cotton, and for 11 years, he planted and chopped and picked without incident. He spoke rarely. He kept his eyes down. He earned a reputation among the other enslaved people at Ashford as someone who survived by making himself invisible. But invisibility was a strategy, not a truth. The trouble began on August 9th, 1853, over a broken hoe. Elijah had been working the east field when the wooden handle split at the socket. He walked to the tool shed for a replacement and found it locked. Creek was in town on business, and Whitfield was at the main house reviewing accounts. Standard procedure required waiting for Creek's return, but the day was hot and the work was behind schedule, and Elijah made a calculation that 11 years of compliance had perhaps earned him the benefit of minor initiative. He found a spare handle leaning against the shed wall and fitted it himself using a file and wedge from the blacksmith's kit. The repair took 20 minutes. He returned to the field and worked until dusk, and he thought nothing more of it until Creek came to the quarters that evening after supper. Someone broke into my tool shed, Creek announced, standing in the doorway of Elijah's cabin. Took a file, took a wedge, took a hoe handle. I borrowed them, Elijah said. Hoe broke in the field. I fixed it and put everything back. You don't borrow what ain't yours, Creek said. You wait for permission. Yes, sir, I understand. Won't happen again. Creek looked at him for a long moment. No, it won't. What happened next was about more than a hoe handle. Creek knew it, and Elijah knew it. In a system built entirely on control, any unauthorized action threatened the whole structure. A man who decided for himself when to fix a tool might decide for himself when to rest, when to eat, when to leave. The distinction between a broken hoe and broken bondage was thinner than most white people in Spartanburg County wanted to admit. Creek reported the incident to Whitfield, who made his decision over brandy in the study while reviewing cotton prices from the Charleston market. Elijah would be shackled for 3 days as an example, hands and feet. He would work in chains so everyone could see what happened to people who forgot their place. They brought Elijah to the yard at dawn on August 10th and fitted him with ankle shackles connected by 18 inches of chain. His wrists went into manacles linked by a shorter span. The iron was old, salvaged from the estate of Whitfield's father, who had preferred corporal discipline through restraint rather than the whip. Thomas had kept the chains in storage and used them rarely, but he used them when he wanted to make a point that would last. Elijah worked the cotton for 3 days, dragging 20 pounds of iron. The ankle chains forced him into a shuffling gait that cut his daily picking rate by half. The wrist manacles made it impossible to reach the higher bowls and left his forearms scraped raw. He ate his cornmeal standing because sitting and rising with the leg irons required assistance. He slept on the floor of his cabin because the chains snagged on his sleeping pallet. Creek checked on him twice daily to ensure the restraints remained secure. The other enslaved people at Ashford watched and understood. A woman named Ruth brought him water during the midday break and said nothing. A man named Jacob helped him to his feet after he stumbled in the field on day 2. That was the extent of the resistance anyone could afford. Open sympathy would mean sharing the punishment. On the 3rd day, August 13th, Whitfield rode out to inspect the work. He stopped his horse near where Elijah was picking and sat in the saddle looking down at him. "Have you learned your lesson?" Whitfield asked. "Yes, sir." "What lesson is that?" "That I don't make decisions that ain't mine to make." Whitfield nodded. "That's right. Tomorrow morning, Creek will take those off. You'll go back to regular work. We'll consider the matter closed." But that night, Elijah Cross made a decision that absolutely was not his to make. The chains came off at midnight. Creek kept the keys to the shackles on a ring in his cabin, which stood separate from the quarters near the main house. He slept lightly as a general practice, trained by years of managing people who had every reason to kill him, but August heat made everyone's sleep heavier. The cicadas were loud, and the air was thick, and Creek had drunk more whiskey than usual that evening to celebrate a profitable week. He did not hear his door open. He did not feel the keys lift from the table. He woke at dawn to find them gone and Elijah's cabin empty. The immediate assumption was flight, every planter's nightmare. A man running north toward free territory, carrying knowledge of routes and schedules that could help others follow. Creek woke Whitfield and organized a search party while the sun was still low. 6 men on horses with rifles and dogs, following a standard pattern for runaways. They checked the river first, then the roads, then the pine woods that bordered the property. They found nothing. It was Thomas Whitfield Jr., the the planter's 7-year-old son, who noticed his father was missing. The boy had come down for breakfast and found no one in the dining room. The house servants didn't know where the master had gone. His horse was still in the stable. His coat was on its hook. Creek organized a second search, this time focused on the plantation grounds themselves, and that was when they found the trail. Boot prints in the dirt leading from the main house toward the far cotton field. 2 sets, one made by workbrogans, standard issue for field hands. The other made by fine leather boots, the kind Thomas Whitfield wore. The workbrogan prints were shallow and even. The boot prints were irregular, dragging, as if the person wearing them had been walking against their will. They found Thomas Whitfield at 11:47 in the morning on August 14, 1853, in the East Cotton Field, 3/4 of a mile from the main house. He was face down between the rows with his wrists shackled behind him and his ankles chained to iron stakes driven 18 inches into the clay. The stakes were the kind used to secure fence posts. Someone had brought them from the tool shed, along with a sledgehammer to drive them deep. The chains were the same ones Whitfield had ordered placed on Elijah 3 days before. He was conscious, but barely. His lips were split and bleeding. His tongue was swollen. The August sun had been beating directly on him for at least 6 hours, probably longer. Creek knelt and checked his pulse, then called for water and a file to cut the chains. 2 of the search party rode for the doctor in Spartanburg, 7 miles east. The others worked to free Whitfield while he drifted in and out of coherence. "Who did this?" Creek asked when Whitfield opened his eyes. Whitfield's answer came in a whisper so dry it barely qualified as sound. "Elijah." The story emerged in fragments over the next hour as they carried Whitfield back to the main house on a litter made from pine branches and canvas. Elijah had come to the house before dawn. He had somehow gained entry through the kitchen door, which Creek had thought was locked, but apparently was not. He had surprised Whitfield in his study, where the planter sometimes worked late on accounts. There had been a brief struggle. Elijah had been holding the overseer's rifle, which he'd taken from Creek's cabin after stealing the keys. He had marched Whitfield at gunpoint through the darkness to the east field. He had ordered him to lie down between the cotton rows. He had shackled his hands and feet and driven the stakes and walked away. And no one had heard a sound because the house was 200 yards distant and the quarters were further still, and August cicadas drowned everything. Dr. Hiram Moss arrived from Spartanburg at 2 in the afternoon with his medical bag and a reputation for discretion. He examined Whitfield in the upstairs bedroom while Creek and the other men waited in the parlor below. Margaret Whitfield's sister, who had been staying at Ashford to help raise the boys after Margaret's death, kept the children away and organized the house servants to prepare broth and cool water. Moss came downstairs after an hour with his assessment. Severe dehydration, mild sunstroke, contusions on his wrists and ankles from the iron, extensive abrasions on his face and chest from lying in dirt. He would recover fully with rest and fluids, but it had been close. Another 3 hours in that sun and the outcome would have been different. "He wants to see you," Moss told Creek. Whitfield was propped against pillows, his face red and peeling. His voice was steadier, but still rough. "I want every able man in the county looking for him. I want him found today. Not tomorrow. Today. We've already sent riders to alert the neighboring plantations," Creek said. "We've got men watching the roads. Dogs are tracking his scent from the quarters. He won't get far. I want him alive," Whitfield said, and something in his tone made Creek uneasy. "When you find him, you bring him back here. You don't shoot him. You don't let anyone else shoot him. You bring him back alive." Is that clear? Yes, sir. Because what he did to me, I'm going to do to him. Exactly what he did to me. And I'm going to let him die that way. Dr. Moss, packing his instruments, said nothing. This was not his concern. He had treated the injury. The rest was plantation business, which meant it fell outside the boundaries of both law and medicine, as practiced in Spartanburg County in 1853. What masters did to their property was their own affair, provided it didn't disturb white people's sleep or interfere with commerce. Reverend Samuel Hutchins heard about the incident at 4 that afternoon, when one of the search party stopped at his church on the county road to water his horse. Hutchins pastored the Methodist congregation that included most of the plantation families in the area, Whitfield among them. He had preached at Margaret Whitfield's funeral 3 years earlier and had baptized both of Thomas's sons. He considered himself a spiritual guide to the community and took that responsibility seriously. He rode to Ashford that evening and found Whitfield sitting in his study with a glass of whiskey, his face bandaged and his wrists wrapped in clean linen. They spoke for 30 minutes about the incident, about the search, about what would happen when Elijah was caught. The law gives you rights, Hutchins said carefully, but mercy is also Christian duty. Mercy, Whitfield repeated. He shackled me in my own field. He left me to die of thirst in dirt I own. You're talking to me about mercy? I'm talking about your soul, Thomas. What you do next will define you. I know exactly who I am, Whitfield said. I'm a man who was humiliated by his own property. Every other planter in this county is going to hear about what happened. They're going to ask what I did about it, and if I show mercy, if I let this pass with a whipping or a sale, they're going to think I'm weak. They're going to wonder if their own people might try the same. I can't afford mercy. None of us can. Hutchins left without pressing further. He rode back to his church and wrote in his journal that evening an entry that would be found 70 years later in a trunk in his granddaughter's attic. August 14th, 1853. Visited T. Whitfield after terrible incident. Advised Christian forbearance. He refused. I did not insist. May God forgive me for my cowardice. What would you do if you were Reverend Hutchins? If you knew that speaking too loudly might cost you your position, your congregation, your standing in a community that depended on slavery for its prosperity? Would you risk everything for a principle? Or would you rationalize your silence as prudence? By evening of August 14th, every plantation within 20 miles knew about Elijah Cross. The story spread through the network of overseers and riders who carried messages between estates, and it spread faster through the network of enslaved people who worked in the big houses and heard everything their owners said. A man had chained his master and walked away free. The details were confused and contradictory, but the core fact was electric. The impossible had happened. At the neighboring Carver plantation, a woman named Sarah whispered the news to her husband Moses while they ate their evening meal. Moses worked the Carver cotton fields and had sometimes seen Elijah at the county market when enslaved people from different plantations crossed paths under white supervision. He had always thought Elijah was quiet to the point of invisible. Apparently, he'd been wrong. They say he's headed north, Sarah said. Up toward Charlotte, maybe, following the river. They say a lot of things. Don't make them true. What if it is true? What if he makes it? Moses looked at her across the dim cabin. Then good for him. But it don't change nothing for us. Carver ain't gonna let his guard down just because some other man's property ran off. But Moses was wrong about that. Every master in Spartanburg County was reconsidering their security that night. Locks that had seemed adequate were being reinforced. Weapons that had been stored casually were being moved to locked cabinets. Work schedules were being adjusted to keep enslaved people under closer supervision. The architecture of control was being inspected for cracks, because if one man could slip through, others might follow. At Ashford, Creek doubled the night watch and ordered all the men from the quarters to sleep in a single cabin under guard. The women and children stayed in their own spaces, but Creek made it clear that any sign of communication with the fugitive would result in collective punishment. Fear was a tool, and he wielded it with precision. A rumor takes root in frightened soil. While the search party scoured roads and woods, Creek went through Elijah's cabin looking for anything that might indicate planning or accomplices. He found almost nothing. A sleeping pallet, a wooden bowl, a change of clothes. The cabin was barely furnished because enslaved people at Ashford owned nothing beyond what Whitfield provided, and he provided only what was necessary for survival and work. But Creek did find one item hidden beneath a loose floorboard. A small book, leather-bound, its pages covered in careful handwriting. Creek took it to Whitfield that evening, and they read it together by lamplight in the study. It was a journal. Elijah had been keeping records for 11 years. The entries were brief and factual. Dates and observations, numbers and names. August 3rd, 1847. Ruth beaten for picking 2, slow, 12 lashes. February 18th, 1849. Jacob sold to Georgia buyer for $800. Wife and children remained at Ashford. June 11th, 1851. Creek shot Silas in the leg for running. Wound festered. Silas died July 2nd. Page after page documenting cruelty with the clinical precision of a court clerk. No commentary, no emotion, just facts and dates. Elijah had been recording everything, building an archive of suffering that he apparently believed might someday matter to someone. The journal contained 53 entries spanning 11 years, and every entry implicated either Whitfield or Creek in violence that was legal under South Carolina law, but damning in its cumulative weight. He was planning this, Whitfield said, though his voice carried uncertainty. This whole time he was keeping score. Or he was just remembering, Creek said. Some people can't forget even when they should. The journal also contained something else that neither man initially noticed. In the margins of several pages, drawn in faint pencil, were small maps. Sketches of the plantation layout. The main house, the quarters, the tool shed, the cotton fields. Distances marked in approximate paces. Notes about sight lines and blind spots. Elijah had been studying Ashford the way a general studies a battlefield, and now he had used that knowledge to humiliate his owner and escape. The search party found tracks heading northeast on the morning of August 15th. Clear boot prints following the river toward the North Carolina border. The dogs picked up a scent and pulled hard on their leads. Creek took 8 men and followed for 6 miles through pine forest and creek bottom, expecting any moment to see Elijah's back as he ran. They found him at midday. Or rather, they found the trap he'd set. A pair of work brogans, Elijah's size, left at the edge of a creek where the trail ended. The dogs went mad sniffing the shoes, while the men looked at each other with growing comprehension. The tracks they'd been following for 6 hours were deliberate misdirection. Elijah had walked northeast for a mile, then doubled back, walking backwards in his own footprints to obscure his return. He'd left the shoes at the creek to give the dogs something to find, while he went somewhere else entirely. "How does a field hand know tracking tricks?" one of the men asked. Creek didn't answer, but he was thinking about the journal, about those careful entries and marginal maps. Elijah hadn't just been recording cruelty. He'd been educating himself, studying patterns, learning from every mistake he witnessed. 11 years of watching had taught him more than Creek had realized a supposedly illiterate slave could know. They returned to Ashford empty-handed at dusk. Whitfield was sitting on the front porch, stronger now, but still bandaged. When Creek explained about the false trail, Whitfield's face went red despite the healing sunburn. He played us. He knew we'd assume he'd run north. Yes, sir. So where did he actually go? Creek pulled out the journal and opened it to one of the marginal maps. He pointed to a small notation at the bottom of the property, near the southernmost field. A single word in faint pencil. Tunnel. The Cotton Gin at Ashford had been built in 1838 by Whitfield's father using cypress timber that resisted rot. The building sat at the southeast corner of the property, where wagons could access it from the county road. Inside, the machinery processed harvested cotton, separating fiber from seed through a system of drums and brushes powered by a horse walking in circles. The work was hot and loud and dangerous. Fingers and hands had been lost to the machinery over the years. Beneath the gin was a cellar that Whitfield Sr. had excavated for storing equipment and seed cotton during wet seasons. The cellar had a dirt floor and stone walls and a narrow entrance through a trap door that stayed locked except during harvest. Whitfield Jr. rarely thought about it. The space was used for storage and forgotten the rest of the year. Creek went to the gin house at first light on August 16th with 4 men and a lantern. They unlocked the trap door and descended into darkness. The cellar was exactly as expected. Old equipment, burlap sacks, cobwebs, but the far wall showed something new. Fresh excavation. Someone had been digging. The tunnel ran 15 feet into the earth at a gentle slope before opening into a larger chamber. The chamber was perhaps 8 feet across, ventilated by a narrow shaft that emerged somewhere in the woods beyond the plantation boundary. Inside the chamber were provisions: dried food, a water jug, a blanket, a tinderbox. The rifle Creek had noticed missing from his cabin, and empty chains where someone had recently been restrained. He wasn't running, Creek said slowly, fitting the pieces together. He was hiding, right here under the gin house, under our noses while we searched the county. They found one other item in the chamber, a piece of paper torn from the journal, pinned to the wall with a nail. The handwriting was Elijah's, and the message was 7 words. I learned patience from the best teachers. Creek posted guards at the gin house and organized a perimeter search, but he knew Elijah was already gone. The tunnel chamber had been abandoned recently, probably the night before when Elijah realized they'd found his journal and would inevitably discover his hiding place. He'd provisioned it months ago, maybe longer, preparing a refuge close to the plantation where he could wait for the initial search to exhaust itself before making his real escape. Now he was somewhere in Spartanburg County with a rifle, supplies, and a multi-day head start, while everyone thought he was running north. Creek sent riders to alert neighboring plantations again, this time warning that Elijah might be hiding nearby rather than fleeing. Patrols were increased. Rewards were posted. The county sheriff became involved, though his jurisdiction on plantation matters was limited unless white people's safety was directly threatened. Whitfield spent those days recovering in his study, reading and rereading the journal. The entries haunted him in ways he couldn't articulate. He had known about the beatings and sales and shootings, of course. He'd authorized most of them, but seeing them listed one after another, documented with dates and details, transformed them from necessary discipline into something harder to rationalize. The journal forced him to see his own history through eyes that had been watching and recording and waiting. On August 19th, 4 men from the Hutchins plantation reported seeing someone matching Elijah's description near the county line. The sighting was brief and uncertain, but it triggered another round of searches that yielded nothing. On August 21st, a store owner in Spartanburg claimed a free black man had purchased supplies using money whose source seemed suspicious. That lead also dissolved into nothing. The truth, which no one suspected yet, was that Elijah had never left the plantation. The stakes had risen into something terrible. September came with cooler nights and the beginning of harvest season. The cotton was ready and labor was needed, and Whitfield couldn't afford to keep half his men on guard duty while the crop rotted in the fields. Creek resumed normal operations with enhanced precautions, but no longer expected Elijah to appear. The consensus was that he'd escaped to the north, or been hidden by sympathizers, or died in the woods. The search was officially abandoned after 2 weeks, though guards remained posted and everyone stayed alert. On the night of September 8, 1853, under a moon 3 days past full, Elijah Cross walked out of the darkness and into Thomas Whitfield's study. He came through the same kitchen door he'd used before, which Creek had locked and barred, but which Elijah opened anyway, using techniques he'd watched the house carpenter demonstrate over years of repairs. He crossed the dark house in silence and found Whitfield alone, reviewing accounts by lamplight. The rifle was aimed before Whitfield could react. "Make a sound, and I shoot," Elijah said quietly. "Nod if you understand." Whitfield nodded. "We're going to walk outside. You're going to do exactly what I did 4 weeks ago. You're going to lie down in that field. I'm going to chain you the same way you chained me. And then I'm going to leave you there until you understand what it feels like." Whitfield's voice came out steady despite everything. "I'll die out there. Maybe. Or maybe someone finds you in time like they found me. That's not my decision. That's up to God or chance or whoever decides these things." They walked to the field in darkness, Whitfield in front and Elijah behind with the rifle. When they reached the same spot, where Whitfield had been found in August, Elijah gave the orders and Whitfield complied because the alternative was immediate death. The shackles went on. The stakes went into the ground. The chains were secured. Then Elijah did something Whitfield hadn't expected. He sat down in the dirt beside him and began to talk. "I've been hiding in the woods," Elijah said. "Not far, close enough to watch. I saw them search. I saw them find my journal. I saw you reading it, and I wondered if you felt anything. Shame, maybe, or regret. But I don't think you did." Whitfield, already uncomfortable in the chains, said nothing. "I wrote down what happened here because I needed to remember I wasn't crazy, that the things I saw were real, that they mattered. You and Creek and the others, you acted like it was all just normal, daily business, the beatings and the sales and the killings, just the cost of doing what you do. But it's not normal. It's not. And I needed to write it down so I could prove it to myself." "What do you want?" Whitfield asked. "If you want me to apologize, I can't. Everything I did was legal. Everything was within my rights." "I know. That's the worst part. You didn't break any laws. You didn't violate any rules. You just did what South Carolina lets masters do, and that's supposed to make it fine. But it's not fine. And writing it down helped me see that." Elijah stood and looked down at Whitfield in the moonlight. "I'm leaving now. I'm taking the rifle and some supplies, and I'm going north for real this time. I've learned enough about covering tracks that I think I can make it. But before I go, I wanted you to spend one night like this. Just one. So you know what it feels like to be helpless and thirsty and not know if anyone's coming. "They'll find you," Whitfield said. "They'll find you and kill you. Maybe, but I'll die free, and you'll live knowing a slave made you beg." Elijah walked away into the darkness. Whitfield called after him, then shouted, then screamed, but the house was too far and the quarters were too distant and no one heard. He lay in the dirt for 6 hours before creek, making rounds at dawn, noticed his absence and organized the search that found him for the second time in a month. This time the dehydration was less severe and the humiliation was complete. Whitfield survived. Elijah vanished. The journal was kept as evidence but later disappeared from Whitfield's study, possibly destroyed, possibly stolen, possibly hidden. No record confirms what became of it. Thomas Whitfield lived another 30 years. He sold Ashford Plantation in 1862, before Sherman's March, and moved to Charleston where he managed investments and died of heart failure in 1883. His obituary made no mention of the incident in 1853. His family never spoke of it publicly. Elijah Cross appears once more in the historical record. A man matching his description and carrying his name lived in Philadelphia in 1858, working as a carpenter and attending abolition meetings. A diary entry by a Quaker activist mentions meeting a carpenter from Carolina who keeps careful records of injustice. The connection is not definitive. Records of escaped slaves were deliberately obscure to protect those who'd fled and those who'd helped them. But the story persisted in Spartanburg County through oral history passed down in black families whose ancestors had been at Ashford. They told their children about the man who chained his master in the field and walked away. They told it as a reminder that power built on cruelty is never as solid as it appears. That someone is always watching, always remembering, always waiting for the architecture of control to show its cracks. The cotton fields of Ashford Plantation are gone now, paved over by a shopping center and a residential development. But on certain August nights, according to some who live near where the old property line ran, you can still hear the sound of chains dragging through dirt and the echo of a voice asking one question. Who decides what's normal, and who decides when it's time to write a different truth? Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.